Everybody loves a good story and secretly hopes for a happy ending, because what really makes for a good story is that it draws you into the action, the drama, so that you find yourself identifying with one or other of the main characters in particular. And you see yourself playing some part or other. And so naturally enough, you don't want to come a cropper, but in the end to emerge as a winner, the hero or the heroine. So you want a happy ending. One of the happiest memories from my school days at primary level involved a favourite teacher. We all probably had one. For me, it was Miss Armstrong. I was about 8 at the time, but every Friday afternoon, if we had been good and worked hard during the week, she would reward us by setting aside the last period of the day on Friday for story time. And she would read to us, week by week, excerpts from a particularly engaging and exciting classic adventure story. Not a sound would interrupt the telling of the story. We were absorbed, and ever so slightly disappointed when the school bell brought the period to a close. And I remember waiting eagerly for the next instalment and making sure that I would do my best to be good during the week ahead. We probably all have memories of some book that made an impression on us for one reason or another. Let me share with you a story from my own family background. 2 years ago, my sister and her husband lost the last of their 3 girls to cystic fibrosis, Jacqueline. She lived the longest. Claire died first at 6.5, Frances Anne at 19. Jacqueline survived till she was 42, mainly because she had had a double lung transplant in 2008, which allowed her to finish a university course in medicine and to practice as a specialty doctor in psychiatry for 10 years before the new lungs began to fail. And she died while COVID was rampant and we were all in lockdown, and her funeral was particularly harrowing for her parents because few were allowed into the church to attend the funeral. Well, we made up for that a year later when the lockdown had ceased, and we gathered for a special memorial service on her first anniversary. And I had the privilege of arranging the service and of telling something about Jacqueline and her story. And central to her story was a book, The Faraway Tree. It first appeared in 1939 as one of a series of books by Enid Blyton about an enchanted wood. And the faraway tree stood in the centre of this wood, huge, forcing its way upwards through the thick foliage and breaking through into a magical landscape with all sorts of mysterious, exciting worlds. Worlds where Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta HMS Pinafore would put it, things are seldom what they seem. That book awakened in Jacqueline a sense of awe and wonder. It unlocked her imagination and encouraged it to soar, to see beneath the surface and beyond the obvious, to become aware of a spiritual, mystical, sacramental dimension to life. Now, Jacqueline was no fool. She relished the power of imagination to provide not an escape into an unreal world of fantasy and make-believe, but instead to provide a breakthrough into the depths of reality, into the world of genuine truth and beauty and goodness that is all around us. You know, it's so easy to go through life blinkered and blind to what's really going on around us, especially in people's lives. As we'll see, that's what the Gospel for this 4th Sunday of Lent is about. Imagination challenges us to see things differently, to see things the way, as the Bible tells us, God Himself sees, from the inside. And then nothing is simply black and white, or set in stone, or beyond redemption. And change becomes possible, change for the better, even radical change. Jacqueline cottoned on. She wasn't just bright, intellectually clever, or competent as a psychiatrist. She was very wise, it seemed at times, beyond her years. And I suspect it came from long years of patient, uncomplaining acquaintance with suffering, and learning to turn pain into prayer. And that was a gift that came to her from her faith. Wisdom, the Bible tells us, belongs to God himself. It's God's way of seeing the whole picture from the inside, and that gives God an advantage. The advantage was spelt out in a simple way in a little book published in 1974 called Mr. God, This is Anna. And the story revolves around the relationship between an adult, Finn, and a little 4-year-old runaway in the East End of London who was called Anna. She was mischievous but worldly wise, constantly surprising Finn with her childlike insights of what was going on around her. And on one occasion, she announced that she knew the difference between people and God. Finn couldn't wait to hear. People, she said, see everyone and everything from the outside, from their own viewing point, so they have only one point of view and it's fairly limited. They can be fairly easily fooled and make quick and rash judgments at times. But God sees from the inside of everyone. He has many viewing points, and he can't be fooled and doesn't make quick, rash judgments. He is patient and compassionate. He looks for and he can see the goodness that often remains hidden, covered over, unused. And that, in fact, is the message that had been already written into the very first page of the whole Bible, the story of God's creation of all things. There in chapter 1 we have a wonderful hymn composed among the priestly circle, which gives us a poetic description of God's working week, as it were, 6 days on and 1 day off, a day of rest. And at the close of each day and of each day's work, God would look over his handiwork and you would hear the refrain, God saw that it was good. And on the final day, when the first humans were in place, we're told that God saw that it was very good. Now, what makes that story so significant is that it actually took the shape that we now have it in that chapter well on in the history of God's people. In fact, at a time when they were in the depths of despair, when they had messed up badly and had lost everything that God had given them, and they experienced deportation to Babylon, the great Babylonian exile. They were back as slaves where they had started from originally in Egypt, but now it was Babylon. And they saw nothing but disaster and ruin. All was black. And it was in that situation that this hymn of faith was formulated. What matters, it tells us, is not that we can't see anything good. What matters is that God can and always does. And that's what he'll build on again and again. It makes it a remarkable insight, doesn't it? And God wants us to share that insight, to share his wisdom. If we're up to it, he wants to help us uncover and recover the goodness in others and in ourselves, and acknowledge it and bring it to the surface. And that is what Jesus offered to do for us when we were invited to join this merry band of followers that is the church, this cavalcade of pilgrims making their way through life, helping those around us, to see the goodness in themselves. So stories are important, and that's why the stories of how faithful disciples themselves coped with life's challenges can be a source of inspiration and encouragement to others. It's why we read the lives of the saints. Personal faith stories flesh out the Catholic tradition in ways that statements of doctrine can't. They bring home to us that the Lord really is around, trying in all sorts of ways to get through to us, to nourish and sustain us by his words, the words that are echoed in the lives of faithful followers. The rite of initiation for adults, which we now use for introducing and welcoming others into our company of faith, doesn't stop because there aren't candidates in one particular year. Because we are still, all of us, on the journey, in the process of being converted to the Lord. And we have stories worth telling and worth people hearing. Let me give you a little story about the RCIA that I first used, when I first used the new rite of initiation in the parish. Despite great scepticism from all sides, clergy and laity, we went through the process. And after the candidates were received at Easter Vigil into the church, they were understandably full of enthusiasm and excitement. A kind of excitement that put the rest of us old hand Catholics a bit to shame. Anyway, one couple came and asked, might they be allowed to bring the gifts of bread and wine to the altar at the offertory on the following Sunday? And of course I said yes. And they were as proud as punch. And they did. It was later on in the hall that a parishioner said to me quietly, you know, as those new converts were coming up the aisle, I heard a couple at the back of the church, old handers, whisper to each other, look at them, they're hardly in and they're starting to take over. Now, we might smile, but that betrayed an attitude that in fact was fairly common at one time and probably survives even among some today. It's the idea that cradle Catholics have more than a head start on new arrivals who join the pilgrimage as adults. So it's good to be reminded that no one, except Jesus himself and his mother Mary, comes from the womb already formed and mature in grace, with no need for conversion. Every Christian disciple is so because each has been called, no matter at what stage, to enter into the long life process of conversion. And our experience tells us that many adult converts in the past and now through the RCA have shone among us as bright stars. Every family probably has them. So the story in the Gospel today is for all of us without exception who are on the journey, and it speaks to us of some important aspect or other of the life of faith. The story is about a man who was cured of his blindness by Jesus one day somewhere about the year 32 AD. But it's more than that, and the early Christians quickly cottoned on to that and got the message. And in the early artwork that can still be seen on the walls of the catacombs around Rome, those tombs, dark underground caves outside the walls of the city, which provided the only safe places for Christians to gather in secret to celebrate the Eucharist. There you'll find several drawings depicting this very gospel story. It was a reminder to them that they themselves had once been blind, but their eyes had been opened through the gift of faith at their baptism. This story is a baptismal story, which makes it more than appropriate for this fourth Sunday of the year in Lent, which is traditionally called Laetare Sunday, Rejoicing Sunday, and we have good reason to rejoice because our baptism brought us out of darkness, the darkness which leaves us feeling isolated at times, looking for meaning and purpose, brought us into the circle of light that lets us see our way. And the source of that light is Christ. And we are heading back to the font to renew our baptismal promises at the Easter Vigil. The question is, have we closed our eyes to what's going on in our own lives and in the lives of those around us? Have we turned a blind eye when we didn't want to see something because we'd have to do something about it? Remember the author Graham Greene, author of Brideshead Revisited fame. He became a Catholic in 1926 before marrying his wife, but that didn't stop him from carrying on with his former lifestyle and indulging in a series of public affairs. In 1949, he actually went with one of his mistresses to a mass being celebrated by the famous saint-to-be Padre Pio, famous for having the stigmata, that is, on his hands and feet, the actual marks of the wounds of Jesus. And he found the experience deeply moving, and he was invited, probably because of who he was, to meet with Padre Pio personally. What a blessing, you might think. How could anyone refuse? But Graham Greene did just that. And when he was asked why, he admitted that he was afraid. He knew that in the confessional, Padre Pio had the gift of seeing deep into the penitent's soul and see even those things that the penitent would prefer to remain hidden. And Graham Greene said, I knew I would have to change if I saw him face to face. I'd need to get my life back on track, and I wasn't ready to change. And so he carried on as before. The story in today's Gospel is a baptismal story, and it's an invitation to all of us on the way to do a bit of soul searching and to open our eyes to what's going on. When we encounter Jesus and are drawn to follow him in the journey of faith, then we will want to open our eyes, and he wants us to look at life in a quite new and challenging way, his way. And that's conversion in practical terms. That same point comes over in that first reading about God choosing David to be king through the prophet Samuel. Now, no one would have even thought about the boy David as a possible candidate. Even his father Jesse never thought of him. He brought forth the 7 other sons he had. But God did think of David. God sees differently, and so must we. When you think about it, we should actually take comfort from that. Rejoice, in fact. Thank God it was God who chose me to be part of the pilgrimage of faith, because if it had been left to others, I might never have made it. But of course, it works two ways. There may be people that I wouldn't be too ready to welcome as companions on the journey. Sometimes we look at other people, particularly people we don't click with or agree with, and say, I don't know how they can call themselves Christian or Catholic. If it were up to me, and it's just as well that it isn't. Jesus wants to open the eyes of the blind, not just those who were physically without vision, but those whose vision was damaged or clouded or so impaired as to lead them into misreading or misunderstanding people and events around them. There are lots of different factors that can blind us to the needs and challenges of the world around us. I came across an article once. I have a tendency to jot things down in a book of memories for myself, and I don't always note where I got the source from. However, I'm sure the author won't mind if I mention it here today. He talks about selfishness which blinds us to the poverty of 2/3 of the world's peoples. They're far enough away for us not to see and so become uncomfortable. Insensitivity blinds us to the struggles and hurts of people who have been marginalised, criminalised, ostracised, denied their human rights, overlooked, ignored because of some misdemeanour or because of the colour of their skin or their religion or race. Snobbery blinds us to the dignity of every individual and allows us to consider them inferior to ourselves. Pride blinds us to our own faults and feelings and to the need for radical change. Prejudice blinds us to the truth. We claim to have a monopoly on the truth. And materialism blinds us to the damage to our world and its environment and to the spiritual and physical well-being of others as a result of our endless self-indulgence. Lent is a time for reviewing and revising the way we are living our lives. Those two words, review and revise, have the same basic Latin root, videre, to see. We are asked by the Lord to take a good, long, honest, unblinkered look at the world around us, at home and abroad, and deep into our hearts and see whether we see what the Lord sees. And I suggest there are two things in particular that Jesus might want us to look at more closely this Lent. First of all, to look for and see the good that there is around us, and especially in people. Matthew chapter 7 challenges us. Why do you observe the splinter in your brother's eye and never notice the plank in your own? Do not judge and you will not be judged. We know ourselves that it's bad enough having to live with the knowledge of our own faults and mistakes without others pointing them out and broadcasting them to all and sundry. We all warm to a bit of recognition, affirmation, a word of encouragement. Maybe we could look for ways of doing that for someone in our current situation, family, at work, in the community. Give them a bit of a boost. And secondly, he asks us to look for alternatives to the way that things seem to be. Don't just moan and say, why doesn't somebody do something? In other words, somebody other than me. Faith calls us to be creative, to practice, not just reactive, to be proactive and not just reactive. Maybe we might look around us, our close companions, and instead of thinking, if only, think rather, what if? Let me finish on a personal note. When I retired from parish ministry about 2 years ago because of mobility issues brought on by arthritis, I had to leave the parish house for the smaller but perfectly suitable house provided for me by the diocese here, back in my home parish, among my own folk, as they say in Scotland. If you've ever had to face house moving, have a flitting, as we say in Scotland, you have to make decisions to jettison lots of things that you've accumulated over the years, and it can be hard choosing what is to go and what's worth keeping. One of the things I've carried with me over these past 60 years is a marble bust of Michelangelo's David. It's hefty, but I value it. I first saw the real masterpiece, the full figure, while I was a student in Rome in the 60s and made a visit to Florence. The figure stands now in the Accademia Gallery in Florence, and it represents the young king-to-be, David, emboldened by his faith to confront the giant Goliath who was set on destroying God's people. And there David stands proud, noble, beautiful in form, a perfect specimen of a human being transfigured by faith. Michelangelo carved it from one huge single block of white marble, Carrara marble, and it now stands at the end of the gallery at the end of a passageway between four huge, massive, unfinished works by Michelangelo that seem to be in the process to be freed from the marble. These figures, they're called the captives of the prisoners, are only half emerged from these huge blocks, and they simply serve to highlight the beauty, the dignity of the figure of David that lies ahead, as Michelangelo saw him. And Michelangelo saw him already embedded in that huge block of marble, and he set himself to free David from all the limitations and fault lines of the marble that were keeping him a prisoner. Michelangelo saw himself as a visionary and his work as sharing in God's creation. He saw that figure of David there waiting to be freed. And that is an image of how God looks at creation and always has done, his way of participating in the freeing of all of us from the blocks that enslave us and make us prisoners. And in one of his sonnets, Michelangelo describes that work of creation. This is what he says: "The best of artists hath no thought to show, which the rough stone in its superfluous shell doth not include. To break the marble spell is all the hand that serves the brain can do." We are called, like Michelangelo, to be visionaries in our own day, to see, to look for the goodness, the potential embedded in each individual, and to work in faith to help uncover and realize the potential, to let the beauty and goodness within them emerge from the darkness that keeps them bound to the glorious freedom of a new day. That's what faith does.